Some searches end with answers. Hers ended with a nightmare. The murder of Steven Galvin, the mother who found her missing son's body. Some stories begin with a silence that only a mother can understand. When Steven Galvin didn't come home, Heather felt something shift, a wrongness she couldn't ignore. Police followed procedure, but her instinct followed a path they never touched. So she searched alone, down forgotten roads and into the woods no one thought to check. And there, in the stillness of the trees, she found what others had missed, her own son. In some stories, the search begins long before anyone realizes what's missing, before the reports, before the headlines, before the police arrive with their measured procedures and distant reassurances. For Heather, it started with a silence that felt wrong. Her son Steven hadn't come home. No message, no explanation, just an absence that grew heavier with each passing hour. When she called the police, they logged the report, traced the usual steps and told her to wait. But waiting is something a mother's heart was never designed to do. So she didn't. She mapped her own routes, knocked on doors the police hadn't reached, walked through fields and side roads others overlooked. Every night she returned home exhausted, and every morning she stepped out again. And then came the day that would change everything. A quiet stretch of land, a narrow trail swallowed by trees, and one small detail that didn't belong. Heather stopped, looked closer, and in that moment, her world broke open. Before any search team, before any investigator, before any official announcement, a mother found what she'd been begging everyone else to find: her son. This is the story of Steven Galvin and the search that no mother should ever have to complete alone. On the morning Steven disappeared, nothing seemed unusual. He left the house with the quiet routine of someone who expected to return later. No dramatics, no warnings, no behavior that might have hinted at danger. He walked out the door with the same familiar rhythm Heather knew by heart. The hours that followed, however, refused to behave normally. Heather tried calling, no answer, tried again, still nothing. At first she tried to rationalize it. Maybe his phone died. Maybe he stopped by a friend's house. Maybe he just needed space. But by evening, those thoughts didn't feel like explanations anymore. They felt like excuses, ones she no longer believed. She reported him missing that night. The responding officers wrote everything down, asked their routine questions, and assured her they would keep an eye out. But to Heather, the pace felt disconnected from the urgency pounding in her chest. Steven didn't vanish like someone who wanted to disappear. Something was wrong, and she sensed it before anyone else did. As midnight approached, the house felt unnervingly still. His room untouched, his shoes still by the door, a jacket he never left without hanging in the chair. Every detail became a quiet alarm. By the next morning, Heather was calling hospitals, messaging friends, searching through online posts, looking for anything that could anchor her fear to something concrete. Nothing came back. It was as if the day had swallowed her son whole. And while the official search had barely begun, Heather's own search had already taken root. She didn't know yet where her steps would lead, only that she couldn't sit still while her son was somewhere out there, waiting to be found. Chapter 2, and the answers never came. The days after Steven's disappearance unfolded slowly, almost deliberately, as if time itself had thickened around Heather. Every hour felt stretched, every minute amplified by the unanswered questions circling in her mind. The police continued with their standard process. They checked known locations, reviewed basic records, and drove through nearby areas. But the search lacked something Heather expected to see: urgency. The kind that comes naturally when the missing person isn't just a name on paperwork, but someone whose absence shakes your entire world. When officers told her they were covering the necessary ground, she nodded out of politeness. Inside, though, she felt the gap widening, the distance between what was being done and what she believed needed to be done. She started keeping her own notes, names of people Steven knew, places he liked, spots he might have passed through. In her notebook, patterns began forming. Small threads the police hadn't mentioned, areas they didn't seem to prioritize. She drove those routes herself, retracing imaginary paths, following instincts she couldn't explain but couldn't ignore either. Neighbors tried offering comfort. He's probably fine. These things sort themselves out. Give it time. But each reassurance felt thinner than the last. Heather didn't want soothing words. She wanted movement, answers, proof that the world hadn't swallowed her son without leaving a trace. Meanwhile, the police updates were brief and cautious. No confirmed sightings, no new leads. We're still checking. Still checking, while Heather felt like she was losing precious ground. Nights were the hardest. She sat by the living room window, watching the quiet street as if expecting Steven to suddenly appear at the end of it. She replayed every recent memory, searching for something she might have missed, something she could have said or noticed or changed. By the end of the first week, one thing had become painfully clear. If she wanted real progress, she couldn't wait for someone else to make it. Heather's patience had a limit, and she was standing right at the edge of it. Heather reached a point where waiting felt indistinguishable from losing time. The police were covering familiar areas, retracing predictable routes, and checking locations that offered little real insight. To her, the search felt narrow, almost confined, as if the investigation was circling the edges instead of moving toward the heart of the problem. So she began her own search. Every morning she left home before sunrise with just a few essentials: a bottle of water, a small notebook, a flashlight, a portable charger, and an inner determination that didn't seem to fade, no matter how exhausted she was. On the first day, she walked through city parks and empty lots, trying to imagine where Steven might have passed. But those areas felt wrong, too open, too exposed, too ordinary for someone who had disappeared without leaving a trace. The next days took her farther out. She stopped at small shops on the outskirts of town, asked strangers if they'd seen anything unusual, and politely requested to check security footage where she could. People were sympathetic but unhelpful. Their answers were always the same. "No, I'm sorry. Nothing out of the ordinary." By midweek, Heather realized the investigation, both official and personal, was drifting in the wrong direction. Steven wouldn't have vanished into a crowded place. If something had happened to him, it was far more likely to be somewhere quiet, somewhere forgotten. That realization pushed her toward the outer edges of the county, to the places maps didn't bother labeling: old service roads, narrow dirt paths swallowed by brush, areas people once used but no longer had a reason to visit. These were the places the police had barely mentioned, and the ones Heather couldn't ignore. She drove through rough, uneven roads, sometimes parking her car and continuing on foot for long stretches at a time. The further she walked, the more she felt the environment closing in. Thick branches overhead, damp soil under her shoes, the smell of wet leaves and cold air settling around her. Some areas felt eerie, others strangely calm. but none of them felt irrelevant. Then came the day that stood apart from the rest. Heather followed a road she hadn't taken before, a narrow entrance half hidden behind overgrown shrubs. Most cars wouldn't have made it through, and hers struggled as she eased it forward. Eventually, she stopped, sensing that going any farther would only trap the vehicle. When she turned off the engine, the silence felt absolute. Something about that silence pulled her in rather than pushed her away. She stepped out carefully, noticing small details around her: flattened grass, the faint trace of tire marks, branches that looked recently disturbed. She didn't know what any of it meant, but she knew better than to dismiss it. The path ahead was tight and uneven. The deeper she walked, the darker it grew, as the canopy of trees shut out the daylight. Her steps slowed, her breathing steadied. Every sound, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, seemed sharper than before. Then she saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a faint patch of color among the muted greens and browns, something fabric-like, something that didn't belong to the forest. Heather moved closer, her pulse quickening. The ground in front of her looked disturbed. Soil shifted, broken branches scattered in a way nature wouldn't have arranged. She knelt. Her hand trembled as she reached toward the fabric, and in that suspended moment, everything, the days of waiting, the unanswered questions, the desperate hope she had clung to, gathered behind her like a single breath. What she found would end her search and begin the part no mother should ever have to face. The moment Heather touched the fabric, she felt something inside her collapse, not because she understood what it meant, but because she feared she already did. Her fingers brushed the edge of the cloth, stiff from the cold air, and as she lifted it slightly, the ground beneath revealed a disturbance too deliberate to ignore. The soil had been shifted, compressed in places, uneven in others. This wasn't natural erosion. Something, or someone, had been here. Heather's breath grew shallow. She stood up slowly, scanning the area around her. A few feet away, a section of the brush looked trampled, as if someone had moved quickly, without care for what they disturbed. The branches bent in odd angles. The earth bore the imprint of weight. Then she saw it, a shape partially concealed beneath the foliage. Not clear, not defined, just the outline of something that shouldn't have been there. She stepped forward, her mind refusing to connect the pieces even as her body moved toward them. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against her ears. She reached out again, pushing aside a clump of branches. And there he was. Steven, not recognizable at first glance. The forest had taken its toll. Time had altered the details. But a mother does not identify her child with her eyes alone. Recognition came in a way she couldn't explain, a certainty that pierced through disbelief. Heather's knees gave way. Her hands trembled violently as she reached forward but couldn't bring herself to touch him. A sound escaped her, not a scream, not a cry, but something raw, broken, instinctive. The kind of sound a person makes when the world they know splits open. For a long moment, she stayed there on the cold ground, unable to move, unable to breathe fully, unable to accept what lay before her. But grief didn't freeze her for long. Shock forced her into motion. Her shaking hands found her phone. She dialed 911, her voice fractured, barely forming words. The dispatcher asked her location. She could only describe the road, the turn she took, the things she passed on the way in. It took time for them to understand where she was. The remoteness of the place made it difficult. When officers finally reached her, they were met with an image they hadn't expected. A mother sitting on the ground beside the one thing she had spent days begging them to help her find. They taped off the area, called for additional units, and began surveying the scene, but even the investigators moved slower than the shock demanded. Heather watched them through a haze, unable to process the mechanical way they took notes, measured distances, and marked evidence. She had been there first, before the grid searches, before the field teams, before the official discovery. And that fact, that unbearable truth, would follow her long after the uniformed men stepped into the forest. Because on that isolated path, in the middle of the woods no one bothered to check, Heather had found what she had prayed she wouldn't: her son. When the investigators took over the scene, they moved with a practiced precision, marking the ground, photographing the disturbed soil, collecting fragments of fabric and debris. Nothing they did could undo that moment or soften its weight. The conditions of the discovery forced the investigation in a specific direction. Because Steven had been exposed to the elements, time had altered the details of his appearance. Identifying him visually wasn't enough, not for the police, not for the coroner, and not for the report that would follow. So the process shifted immediately to forensic confirmation. His remains were transported under sealed protocol, escorted by officers who understood the gravity but not the story behind it. The body was delivered to the medical examiner's office, where the first step was establishing identity beyond doubt. DNA became the deciding factor. Swabs were taken, comparisons were initiated. Heather provided what was needed, a simple act that carried an unbearable emotional weight. When the results came back, the confirmation was direct and final. The remains belonged to Steven Galvin. No room for error. No alternative explanation, no chance he had walked away from the life he knew. With identity confirmed, attention turned to the autopsy, the one procedure everyone was waiting on, hoping it would offer clarity where everything else had failed. But answers didn't come easily. The medical examiner documented the condition of the remains, noting environmental impact, decomposition patterns, and the lack of immediate markers that could clearly define a cause of death. Every detail mattered, yet few of them pointed to a single, solid explanation. What happened to Steven? The report didn't say, at least not publicly. Authorities withheld the exact findings, releasing only what they legally had to. Steven's death was not natural. It was considered suspicious. The case was classified as a criminal investigation. That was all. No timeline, no mechanism, no official cause. Just a void where the truth should have been. For Heather, the silence felt almost as cruel as the discovery itself. The forest had taken her son, and now the investigation seemed to refuse her closure. Detectives promised they were exploring every possibility, but none of them could disguise the unease in their voices, the sense that this case would not resolve quickly or cleanly, or maybe at all. As the days passed, the unanswered questions only multiplied, lingering in the air like something unfinished. What had brought Steven to that isolated place? Who had been with him? And why had the truth followed him into the woods but refused to follow him back? News travels fast when it carries tragedy, but this story spread for a different reason, because of how it unfolded and who reached the truth first. Within hours of the identification, local reporters learned a detail they couldn't resist. Heather had found Steven before the police did. It became the headline everywhere. Mother discovers missing son's body in remote woods. Police arrived after grieving mother found her own child. A search that shouldn't have been hers alone. What had been a private nightmare was now a public narrative. Journalists gathered outside the police department. Some tried to reach Heather, though she avoided every camera. Others pushed investigators for answers. Why hadn't the search included the remote area sooner? Why had a mother been forced to do the work of a trained team? And what did it say about the investigation that she'd gotten there first? Press conferences grew tense. Officers insisted they had followed procedure, that the area was difficult to access, that timing and terrain had limited their reach. But none of that softened the public reaction. People weren't hearing technical explanations. They were hearing a story of a mother who did what the system didn't. Online discussions amplified it further. Users shared the news with outrage, sympathy, or both. Hashtags emerged asking why the search lacked urgency. Even strangers who never knew Steven found themselves defending Heather, as if her determination had become symbolic. A reminder that sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest to accept, that love can outpace protocol, and instinct can outrun procedure. Meanwhile, the media crafted a narrative that was compelling, but far from gentle. They painted Heather as a tragic hero, a mother driven by something beyond fear, a figure standing alone in the woods with only her will to guide her. The story resonated, but it came at a cost. She lost any chance at privacy, any space to grieve quietly. The investigation, now under public pressure, shifted tone. Detectives spoke more cautiously. Updates became less specific, and every move was measured against the headline none of them could escape. A mother found what they could not. The media storm didn't solve the case. It didn't expose a culprit or explain what happened in those woods, but it did something the investigation hadn't managed yet. It turned Steven's story into a collective question, a question that still had no answer. After the media storm settled into a steady hum of coverage, one truth remained untouched. Steven's death was still without explanation. The investigation had labeled it suspicious, but that word only marked the beginning of a much longer maze. Detectives reviewed Steven's final days, tracing routines, interviewing acquaintances, searching for conflicts or confrontations that might point toward a motive. But every name they gathered, every location they revisited, led them back to the same uncomfortable starting point. Nothing clearly connected Steven to the place where he was found. He had no reason to be in that remote stretch of woods, no known friends in the area, no habits or interests that would pull him toward such an isolated location. This raised the first and most obvious theory. 1. He didn't go there alone. If someone led him there, or forced him there, the forest's seclusion suddenly made sense. That kind of location serves a purpose only when a crime depends on not being seen. But without a timeline, the investigators lacked the markers needed to match the theory with evidence. The forest had kept too many secrets for too long. 2. A targeted confrontation. Detectives briefly explored whether Steven had recently argued with someone, a friend, a stranger, someone he'd crossed paths with unexpectedly. But interviews brought nothing concrete. His life held no obvious feuds, no statements of threat, no suspicious messages. The absence of conflict only deepened the mystery. 3. A case of mistaken identity. Some investigators considered whether Steven might have been targeted by someone who meant harm to another person. The wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong face. But this theory, too, struggled under the weight of the unknown. 4. An opportunistic crime. Criminologists consulted on similar cases suggested a darker possibility. A chance encounter with someone unstable or violent, a moment that escalated unexpectedly, leading to a hurried attempt to hide the evidence. Remote areas are often chosen not because of who the victim is, but because of what the location offers: distance, silence, time, 5. A planned act by someone familiar with the terrain. The spot where Steven was found wasn't obvious. It wasn't visible from the road. It required navigating uneven ground, weaving through dense brush, and recognizing which parts of the terrain would conceal someone long enough to avoid detection. Whoever brought him there, if someone did, knew the area better than he ever could have. 6. The path that leads nowhere, yet. The investigation, despite interviews, searches, and forensic examinations, hit a wall, not due to lack of effort, but because the evidence that remained was fragmentary, incomplete pieces of a puzzle that didn't form a full picture. What was left behind told a story that couldn't be heard clearly. Disturbed soil, an unfamiliar path, fabric hidden under branches, a body left in a place no one was meant to find, except Heather did. And that fact reframed everything. Her discovery didn't just reveal where Steven was, it revealed where the investigation hadn't looked, where answers might still be buried, and where the truth may remain hidden, waiting for the right detail, the right witness, or the right moment to bring it to the surface. But until that moment comes, one question hangs over the case like a shadow. Who led Steven into those woods, and why did he never walk back out? In the end, the forest held more questions than answers. Detectives came and went, reports were filed, statements were recorded, but none of it could undo the weight of what Heather had seen, or the path she had been forced to walk alone. Long after the police finished their work at the site, Heather returned to the edge of the woods. Not to search, the search was over, but to breathe in the silence that had become part of her story. The path she had taken that day wasn't just a trail through trees. It was the place where instinct overruled procedure, where a mother's determination illuminated what official steps had failed to reach. People later described her discovery with words like unimaginable, heartbreaking, unthinkable. But Heather never used those words. She simply said the truth. I had to keep going. To her, that was all the explanation the world needed, and all the explanation the world would ever get. Steven's case remains a mystery. The investigation is still marked by unresolved details, theories without conclusions, and a timeline that doesn't quite fit together. But its impact lingers far beyond the case file. It lingers in the questions people ask about the search, in the way the community speaks his name, in the quiet criticism of a system that moved too slowly, and most of all, in the echo of a mother's footsteps through a place no parent should ever have to walk. Heather didn't find closure in those woods. She found her son. And sometimes, that is the only ending a story like this allows. Some answers never surface. Some truths remain buried in the quiet places where no one thinks to look. But a mother's search doesn't disappear. It leaves an echo in every step she took, in every road she traveled alone, and in every silent question the world could not answer. Steven's story lingers in the spaces he left behind, in the unfinished timeline, in the stillness of the woods, and in the strength of the woman who walked into the darkness when no one else would. Some stories do not end. They just become quieter, waiting for someone someday to finally listen. Next on True Echoes. A college student begins a late-night drive home, one he should have completed in just a few hours. But somewhere along that empty highway, something changes, and a disappearance that has haunted investigators for over a decade. The case of Bryce Lespisa. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. Some searches end with answers. Hers ended with a nightmare. Some stories never close. They echo through the spaces we can't explain. If you had been in her place, what choice would you have made? Leave your thoughts below and step into the next chapter. And step into the echoes of truth.